The Prophecies of Gorric Part 1, My Thoughts on Spirituality and the Next Step in the Evolution for the Human Race. Warning: this is to warn you the opinions expressed in this book are strictly that. I do not claim that anything written in this book should be taken at face value, and the intent of this book is not to make you believe what is written on these pages but is only meant to inspire thought and free thinking. Everything written within these pages are just my thoughts so far, and are subject to change. However, a word of warning to the religious: what you will learn in Part 1 may be damaging to your beliefs. Not so much in this lifetime. You could shrug off everything I have to say, but in your next lifetime, you see, once you have heard the concept that I'm going to talk about, you cannot undo it. There is a danger that my words could corrupt you. You will take what I have to say to the grave with you, whether you remember this consciously or not, and it could influence you in the next life. After today, you may never believe in God again, in any of your future lifetimes. Preface: I was doing research for part of a storyline in a book of fiction that I was writing, when I was struck with an epiphany. It was a realization that the amount of information that I knew on the subject in question, including my own interpretations, was broader and very in-depth in its own right, and went far beyond what I required for the storyline that I was working on. I had realized that the research I was doing and the knowledge that I had accumulated over the last 52 years on the subject, was probably enough for a book in itself. So here, I find myself writing a new preface for another book. In a way, I think that this may have been a timely epiphany for me. You see, this will be the first time that I actually finish a book. I have 5 or 6 books floating around in my head to be written. One of these books is in the research stage, another I have about 12 chapters done, and now this book. This book is not meant to be a book of fiction. The subject matter is on a few different things that I have come to realize over the years, including some of my visions on the future, along with some of my own personal experiences. Therefore, I am going to pass on my interpretations on these subjects, including my spin on the question of life and death and the next step in human evolution. Keep in mind that everything written within these pages are just my thoughts, not necessarily my beliefs. The search for God. Now it is important to note that I am not trying to give a history lesson here. I am just trying to make a point based on general facts. I acknowledge up front that there are going to be exceptions in some of my arguments and observations. However, these things do not change the overall point that I am attempting to make. Thousands of years ago, before any kind of organized religion existed anywhere on the planet, humans became aware of a feeling they thought of as a presence of something greater than themselves. So began the search for God. As you may or may not know, there have been many thousands of different gods throughout the history of the human race: animals, plants, fish, the moon, sun and stars, kings, living and dead, volcanoes, comets, and the list goes on and on. Then eventually, through much struggle and thought, humanity eventually settled on the concept of the one God, which is what is believed in most of today's religious circles. There are many God-based religions in the world, but I think there is a consensus among most of these different religions that they're all giving homage to the same God, just in different ways. One of the interesting things about the search for God is the similarities in the concept of God throughout history. Most of these gods were powerful beings that had all manner of different godly powers. Some of these gods were benign and specialized in what they could do. However, even these gods had other powers at their disposal. It is fascinating when you think about it, why so many similarities, from so many different types of gods from so many different places in the world. If you made a list of all the gods, then made a list of all their godly powers and responsibilities, you would see that a great many of these gods had a lot in common. Even just the fact that we have considered or imagined a being like a god with abilities beyond our own is telling. The question remains though, why? To me it's like the search for God went through a refinement period through many generations, from early times where anything had the potential for being a god until finally settling on the one God concept. And now for thousands of years that hasn't changed. Does that mean the search is over? I find the thought of the one God interesting. Is there only one God? It's not that there's one God for you and this guy over there, or one God for you and you and you. It's one God for everyone, not an individual God that everyone has as their own. Right. What I have been able to ascertain is that everyone who believes in God experiences God in his or her own way, which is an individual point of view of the concept of God. So how can that be? Shouldn't there be a more commonality amongst the believers' experiences? And I am not talking about worshipping or other religious practices. I am talking benchmarks that all believers should share in experiencing God. But in truth that is very rare. God seems to be an individual experience, within the singular overarching concept. This leads me to my next thought. What if the presence of God is a case of mistaken identity, a mistaken judgment? Because once humanity settled on the concept of the one God, there was no reason to look any farther. What if a new concept of what this greater presence is, came along, that actually made sense and conformed better to 21st century thinking? The way I look at the whole question is, that if there is a God, we have not found that God yet. I will tell you why. The day the human race finds God, there will be no doubt. Every human on the planet will know it is true. There will not be a competition in judgments between the God-based religions like those that we see today with the Jewish, Catholics, Christians, Muslims, and Protestants, etc., and with all the orthodoxy that goes along with them. Everyone in the world will understand. There will not be any non-believers the day humanity truly discovers God, because there will be no conflict between faith and reason. I think the search for God is not over, and in the human time scale, maybe it's still in its infancy. I think that first century thinking, and the religious doctrine that goes along with it, is stopping us from evolving spiritually. I think that until we start looking at things through 21st century eyes, things will continue to stagnate and stay as it is, a new concept and residual memory. I will start here by saying that the concept I'm going to introduce everyone to, is based on the idea, that there is life after death. There seems to be a huge consensus throughout history with religious and non-religious beliefs that there is an afterlife. I consider that an important benchmark, based on the idea that life after death is persistence throughout human history. There is something going on collectively with this belief. I describe it as residual memory. Residual memories are fragments of memories from our many lifetimes, including memories of how we live our lives after we die in the afterlife. Therefore, the reason most humans believe in some form of life after death is that it is probably true. Somewhere in our subconscious we remember. However, it is almost an intuitive type of memory. It is not an upfront and personal type of memory. It is more a memory about how we feel. I think we are influenced by these residual memories throughout our lifetime. The impressions from these memories are an important driving force in the advancement of the human race, and we are driven to express these memories in any way we can. I think we are attempting to emulate the way we live our lives in the afterlife during our time on Earth. However, it goes much further than how I equate this idea to the advancements of the human race. I think that our residual memory will bring us closer to an understanding of who we are, eventually. I think that we have been leaving ourselves hints throughout human history, in our art and literature, music and plays, in all the creative ways we use to convey messages, and it all began when people became capable of rationalizing their own existence. I think one of the best examples is some people's beliefs in the gods. Right from the beginning, no matter what god, there seemed to be an impression that this god must have special powers. Why? I think most of the gods recorded in history were all powerful in some way. I say again, why? What I find even more intriguing is how we imagine our new gods, the superheroes in comics, books and movies, toting all kind of wonderful superpowers. It makes me wonder if there's some type of refinement going on with our residual memory as we continue to advance as a race. Even as we speak in explanation, I believe that all the good and bad that happens in this world is humanity's responsibility alone. However, this does not mean because I do not believe in heaven or hell, that I do not believe in spirituality, though I have another term I will use in this book for our spiritual presence, and that's who you are. Let me qualify that last statement with an explanation. It's one thing to hear the leaders of your religious organization speak to you about spirituality, and quite another if you actually realize that you're a spiritual being. There are spiritual people out there. Some I think feel spirituality because their faith may have brought them to that point, but that is not necessarily true for all spiritual people. I feel strongly that I'm a spiritual being, and no faith was required to awaken me to the fact, just my life's experiences. So let me try to explain a point of view that I think most people are not familiar with. When you look in a mirror, you can see yourself looking back at you. However, you can never see who you are, and who you are is the key, the mind behind the mask. I think in some small way this alone proves we are spiritual beings. The fact we are only able to see our own facade in our reflection and nothing more, is telling to me. Most of us at some point in our lives will experience a moment of uncertainty when looking at their reflection. Maybe for a fleeting moment you see a stranger looking back at you, then that moment passes and you shrug off the feeling without a second thought. Why do you think that is? What was that fleeting moment of uncertainty? Perhaps for a moment your subconscious mind was attempting to see beyond your reflection, attempting to see the mind behind the mask, or alternatively, who you are. When we describe ourselves as humans, it is a description of ourselves on this earthly plane, in the flesh and blood. How would we describe ourselves if we knew our humanness was the smaller part of who we are, and that the conscious and unconscious mind was part of a much larger consciousness, that as sentient beings, there is a multi-dimensional aspect to our existence? How could we describe ourselves, who we are? Picture two spheres, one the size of a tennis ball, the other the size of a soccer ball. Both these spheres represent the makeup of your spiritual existence, who we are. To make things easier for this explanation, we'll call the small sphere, you, and the large sphere, who you are. Now you notice that, who you are, is much larger than you. This is the way I have visualized this, which I know is crude and very simplified. However, it is just to give you a visual reference to my observations and arguments. Who you are, is part of your spiritual self, the greater mind. It holds all your knowledge of all your lifetimes and is the part of yourself that you commune with when you are sleeping. Some of who you are shares your consciousness and is witness to your life experiences. That part of who you are is your spiritual presence within you, which represents your consciousness in this world. The reason I visualize this concept in the way that I do, is that I am trying to explain this from the point of view of that, who you are, represents many life experiences, so the sum of who you are is greater than the one life experience of you. Therefore, you see, that all of who you are could never fit within you, on this earthly plane, with the concept, who you are, represented by the large sphere, is persistent from the time of its creation. Life and death only happens to you on this earthly plane. Who you are exists, whether or not we live or die as human beings. When a human is born, at some point in the womb the child will gain consciousness. It is at this stage that, who you are, which represents our immortal existence, sends a part of its own consciousness to interface with its new human form. This interface stays connected right up until the day they die. This part of who you are, that communes with the child in the womb, is the beginning of the child's own consciousness, and this child's new consciousness also represents a new spiritual presence in our world. When you die, the part of you that was originally part of who you are, which was your consciousness and spiritual presence on this earthly plane, is reabsorbed back into who you are, with all the knowledge and experiences that you gained during your lifetime. The main part of who you are does not take up space inside of us, because our brains have not advanced enough yet to process the amount of information that all our life experiences represent. Your unconscious mind is the interface between you and who you are. Your unconscious mind communes with who you are when you are sleeping, and reviews all your day's experiences. It is sort of like backing up your computer every night, and the parity is part of a pattern that I will talk about a little later. When we sleep, we back up the day's events to who you are. This backup will only occur during our deepest slumber, when our bodies are in the state of sleep paralysis. It is at this moment, who you are awakens on the other side and goes about its business, which could involve analyzing the day's events. Who you are is much more aware of you than you are of who you are. Who you are is incapable of influencing you beyond some subtle influences, because the human race is not advanced enough spiritually or physically to be able to interface with who you are at any higher level. You so, who are you? Well, I think you are combinations of who you are and you. For starters, we need to add the DNA from your parents, or you could not exist. However, I think there may be another type of DNA. This other DNA is what I call spiritual DNA, which is a part of who you are. This spiritual DNA is made up of a three-dimensional copy of human DNA that is extracted at the time of death. The best of the spiritual DNA that exists within your spiritual DNA data pool, which is an accumulation of all spiritual DNA collected throughout all your many life experiences, is what is used for a new life experience. As much of this spiritual DNA as possible is imprinted on the unborn child during the acquisition of consciousness. This spiritual DNA is also the main source of our residual memory. I will explain a little more on the aspect of this spiritual DNA later on. Blank stem cells may also have something to do with this part, but I do not have the big picture yet. We must also include the reasons or goals we set out for ourselves for this new life experience. This is something that will influence you only on the subconscious level in very subtle ways. However, achieving some of these goals is very important too. who you are, because it is a measure of how we advance spiritually. In addition, the influences of the environment you are born into, including all experiences you will have within those environments within your lifetime, is very instrumental in how you will turn out in life. Will you be successful in achieving any of the goals who you are set out for you to achieve, or will these original goals be twisted out of context in some type of war-torn environment, or worse? Therefore, you see where you were born, and how you live your life is important because you are the sum of who you are, and the life you live. With most people, the original purpose you had for being reborn gets lost and is only sometime realized again late in life by people with open minds. That is what makes up you who you are, the mind behind the mask. Nobody truly has the answer to that question. With all our advancements in science, we are still not that much closer to unraveling the mysteries of the mind. Every glimpse of some truth only leads to more questions, and don't talk about the exceptions of the truth, because no one wants to address things like that if it can be avoided. Like people who have very little brain matter, their skulls are mostly a void, yet some of these people have high IQs, and are able to function in the real world like anyone else. Alternatively, how about a more recent statement that's been circulating within the science community, that there seems to be some type of outside influence on our brains, because the amount of energy that runs the brain cannot be rationalized based on what can be measured inside the brain. Who you are represents your immortal being, your greater consciousness, the source of all your lifetimes, past, present and future. Who you are is the whole of records of everything we have done, good or bad, in our human forms here on earth. Who you are is also the reservoir for all the spiritual DNA collected over our many lifetimes, and is the source of our residual memory that helps to drive the human race forward into the future. Who you are is your spiritual self, the unseen presence that early man felt, that ultimately lead to the belief in the gods, and the belief in the one God that dominates many of today's religions. The one God concept is another benchmark for me, and a strange kind of irony. All the many thousands of gods have trickled down to the one God. We have been so close to the truth for thousands of years now. The way I see it, however, we have never been able to see that the one God, the one presence, is an individual experience that everyone seems to share because it is just who we are. Have you ever been experienced each lifetime as a new experience? Who you are is made up of generations of these experiences, some good and some bad. The good experiences add to who you are in a positive way and helps us to become greater spiritually. Alternatively, negative experiences add to who you are in a negative way by stopping us from moving forward spiritually. This give and take in the growth of who you are is one of the reasons we return to our human form, to try again, with the hope of getting it right the next time. However, that is not the only reason we return to the singular life experience. There is a symbiotic relationship as well. We do not experience emotion in the afterlife the same way we do in our singular lifetimes. In the afterlife, we experience likes and dislikes, euphoria and disappointment, and many other emotions we are familiar with. However, we do not feel intimacy, true love or lust, pain, emotionally or physically in any way, and we cannot feel hate and real anger or enjoy the taste of food. We need the human form and three-dimensional space to experience those things. Those emotional experiences we have when we are alive are very important to our growth spiritually here and in the afterlife, and is a huge driving force for us to return to the land of the living. There is also a natural flow of spiritual energy that flows from who you are to you as well. This spiritual energy always flows from who you are to you, except for when you are sleeping. That is when part of the flow reverses, so you are able to back up the day's events. Nevertheless, there are things that we do as humans, which can disrupt the natural flow of this spiritual energy, and effectively dumb us down spiritually, creating the possibility that we may never reach our full potential as spiritual beings here on earth. One of the most negative influences on spiritual energy in our lives, I believe, is religion. A little to do about nothing. Religion. When we focus on the belief in God, we disrupt the natural flow of the spiritual energy that flows from who you are to you. It's like wading upstream instead of going with the flow. Let me explain my thoughts on this. You see, who you are is the presence we feel, that we call God. When you think you are in the presence of God, you really have just become aware of who you are. This feeling of the presence is what drives humans to believe that there has to be something divine out there. However, it is only who you are you have had a glimpse of, not God. Therefore, when you pray to God, you are focusing the spiritual energy that flows from who you are to you, back to who you are, sending this gift back to its source, effectively cancelling out most of the beneficial properties of this spiritual energy. Religious people have been making this mistake for thousands of years with very few exceptions. I think that religion has held us back in the evolution of our spirituality. Instead of learning to use our spiritual energy for beneficial purposes, we have mostly wasted it instead. The feelings of love and rapture, praise and spiritual well-being are emotions that help us identify our spiritual energy. These feelings and emotions that are associated with our spiritual energy was meant to be shared amongst ourselves, so we are better able to nurture and care for each other. The spiritual energy that flows from who you are to you should never be disrupted or redirected. Praying to God is one of the most destructive forces when it comes to disrupting the natural flow of this beneficial spiritual energy. When someone you love gets seriously hurt, and needs emergency help, in the fevered pitch to get help, you will often see the ones closest to the victim gathering as closely as possible to them, hoping to find anything they can do to help their loved one, even believing at that moment that just being by that person's side has to help. You see this over and over again in these situations. It's a repeating pattern. I think it is possible, in the type of emergency when the urgency is the greatest, our baser instincts take over, and the connection to who you are is energized and strengthened, making you feel empowered. You believe for a moment that you have the power to help, and that you have as much right to be at your loved one's side as any emergency room doctor. Those of you who know, who have gone through that experience may have felt the way I just described it, without understanding why. You see, your instincts were right. It is just that we're not spiritually mature enough to do much more about it. It's like we have the right tools to do the job we need to do. We just haven't felt the need to read the instruction manual, because there is supposed to be someone who can fix all the problems for us. It's the way religion has conditioned us. We're not supposed to look outside the box, or consider any other possibilities, because everything you need to know can be found in one book. We can help heal our sick with our spiritual energy. Let me tell you how it works. It usually only works with someone you have a deep connection to, someone you love. You could never just open some clinic to heal the masses. However, at the same time, if we all thought way I do, we would not have to. Families could just help to heal themselves. The stronger the emotional connections, the more likely the chance for success. For someone you truly love, to start with, you have to believe you can be a benefit to the person that needs help. Knowing that you may be able to help heal them goes a long way. However, the hardest part is the commitment. You have to spend as much of your free time as possible with the loved one you want to try to heal. If you have a job, take a leave of absence, or quit for a while. This is so very important. If you want to help heal someone you love, then you have to be there. There is no other way. Just a word of warning. A full commitment means your personal life or standing in life could be changed. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be. The commitments you have to make are sacrifices, a sacrifice you must make to be successful. However, it could be good for the person you are trying to heal, but at the same time, it could be bad for you, so be prepared. If you are a religious person, do not pray to God to heal the one you love in their presence. I will try to explain this in a way you may understand. Use God's love to help heal the one you love, not with prayer. Don't fire prayers off to God, wasting the Holy Spirit He has given you. Your God is all-powerful and He has no needs. Therefore use the gift of God's love to heal the one you love, whose needs are very great here on earth. Save your prayers for when you are alone or at your place of worship. Maybe they'll be prayers of thanks. All you have to do, if you can, is feel God's love. Combine it with the love you feel for the person you're trying to heal and stay close. There is nothing magical you have to do. Just stay close as often as you can. Now, in that last paragraph, I was not trying to be condescending in any way. To me, God, in the religious sense, is just a title that religious people use to define the presence of who you are. I have often daydreamed of a world where you could take a leave of absence from your work to heal a loved one, and it would be just part of the everyday routine of that world, similar to the maternity leave, which is available to people in some countries today. Now, there are no guarantees in life. There are different levels of success, depending on how much love you have for the person you're trying to heal, and how well connected you feel you are to who you are, and on how much time you have committed to the healing the one you love. However, there are sure to be failures for whatever reasons. There are many things that can go wrong, and of course, if everyone took what I have said to heart and followed what I have said, we would only still be at a newbie level in practice. However, if you never try, you will never know, and never learn to believe. When do we become human? When a woman is ready to conceive, her body sends out a signal in the form of pheromones, which will attract a man to mate with her. Now there are many who could argue on this point in this day and age, but at some point in human evolution our animal instincts were more acute. It had a lot to do with our survival instincts, and we can still see this behavior in animals today. During conception, thousands of sperm swarm the egg in a competition to fertilize the egg, but only one generally will become the victor. Then later, when the brain of the child in its mother's womb has developed enough to house a new consciousness, it will send out a signal, and the pattern of competition will begin again. However, this time it will be a competition of souls, or, who you are, competing to be reborn. I think that it is possible that humanity does not begin until the child in the womb has achieved true consciousness. Think about it for a minute. We are not human until we gain consciousness, or self-awareness. I have no concept at this time when in the gestation period that would be. However, if at some time in the future the concept I have illustrated here is proven to be true, think of the implications. The same pattern of competition that occurs at birth, repeats throughout our lifetime as well. This repeating behavior of competing is another one of the driving forces of modern man. I think there may be a competitive gene that has some of the same mechanics and characteristics of the selfish gene, which we have heard some scientists refer to, on a number of occasions. To truly understand where I am coming from with my thoughts, you would have to be able to see things the way I do. I hope by the end of this book, you will at least have a gleaning on how I think. So it is important for me to say before I go on here, that different ideas I put forth in these chapters, may or may not hold some interest to you. Nevertheless, the true message in these thoughts of mine will be found in the sum of all its parts. So read on. Chaos and repeating patterns. During our short stay on this mortal plane we will be exposed to repeating patterns and shapes everywhere. These patterns and shapes are represented by what we see and hear, smell and touch and think, etc. It exists in our literature, our music and art, in our bureaucracies, philosophies and religions, in nature, from the tiniest particles to the huge galaxies that spin through this vast universe that we live in. Anyways, you get the idea. Everything has some type of repeating pattern to it. Isn't it interesting, for example, that every country has a different way of saying hello, but no matter how many ways it is written or said, it only represents one thought, which is a greeting, and that thought is the same in all languages. Hello, bonjour, salam, prajapno, hola, privet and aong namast, hedson ni hao, konnichiwa, tsing dobry, jambo, shalom, sword, boner, aloha. Bureaucracies, no matter where you go, it's always there in some form, a repeating pattern that is never exactly the same, but similar enough for you to understand what it is. No matter what country you're in, or what language that is spoken, everywhere you look, there is symmetry, from the roots of a tree that look like the veins in your body, to spinning of water going down a drain, having a similar pattern of motion to vast galaxies moving through space. Similar patterns are everywhere, but in vastly different forms. This is what is referred to as the chaos theory. Think for a moment of all the different repeating patterns and shapes that are all around you in your life, and you see that even in the chaos that exists all around you, that there is an order to everything as well. Can you see it? I do. There is not a thought, and a sight, and a sound, a taste, or a smell, or even the bureaucracies we live with, that is not part of a repeating pattern. We organize our lives around it, and it gives us comfort. I truly believe that it must be universal. CT searching for life in the universe sends a signal that contains prime numbers. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that any intelligent race with 2 fingers or more, and has evolved to a point where it can send and receive radio signals, will know how to count. It's a given, a no-brainer. A pattern we use here on Earth for counting turns out to be universal. So if repeating patterns of numbers can be universal, what else could there be that's a universal pattern? How about just about everything? Why would the different ways to express the thought hello be restricted just to Earth? Wouldn't intelligent civilizations all over the universe have some form of greeting, and some form of bureaucracy? I think that chaos, in the way I have just illustrated it here for you, is a type of universal law, and not just in nature, but also in how everything in nature expresses itself everywhere. It spans time and space, is multidimensional, and is the same for us in life, as it is in the afterlife, because even death is a repeating pattern, and I am sure it's a universal one. Chaos, death, and more of the same, the patterns that we live with in life, shapes, motion, color, communication, competition, emotions, bureaucracy, etc., continue in the afterlife, after we die. After we pass on, we remember all of our lifetimes that we have experienced, and we handle it as easily as we handled the everyday routines we had when we were alive. It's just one of those, just the way it is, things for us in the afterlife. It may even be possible that the underlying flavor of your personality persists throughout all your lifetimes. That may help to explain how sometimes you can meet a complete stranger who seems familiar to you, even though you have never met. I have had this experience myself on more than a few occasions. On one of those occasions, the feelings of joyful recognition I was getting was so powerful, it felt like part of me was about to jump out of my skin. I think this phenomenon happens to people that are sensitive enough to recognize someone on the spiritual level. I think even love at first sight can be explained this way in some cases. If you meet someone in this lifetime, who was someone you had strong emotional ties with in a past life, I think that there is a real possibility that a relationship you may have had in the past life can continue in this life. Does the expression, soulmate, sound familiar? Who you are in the afterlife is still an individual, just not in the singular sense of you, when you were alive. There is a type of collective consciousness that is the standard form of communication on the other side. It is the type of thing which can be either tuned in or tuned out, but it is something that you're always aware of. This form of communication is never intrusive, because who you are is always in control of anything that is received or that is passed on. Communication is also instantaneous and conveys more than just words, thoughts, sounds, and images. Even snapshots of your emotional state for any given time can be conveyed. This quick way of communicating in the afterlife is something we try to emulate in this life, with telephones and TVs, computers with the internet, and all other forms of telecommunications that we use in our daily lives. I think that many of the technologies that we have created are influenced by what we are used to in the afterlife, and I think that our residual memories have had important influences on our advancements in all these technologies. Think of how fast people like to travel. We are always striving to move faster, and to do things faster and more efficient. What instruments do we use to measure the progress of our perfection? How do we recognize the benchmarks in life we need to follow? I think that the residual memories of our afterlife hold the answers to those questions. I also think that some form of bureaucracy will be waiting for us on the other side, and I cannot help thinking that we may all be able to take some comfort in that. Eye for an eye in the afterlife. You will experience many of the same things that you experienced when you were alive. However, because the human form is not part of who you are, the constraints and restrictions that applied to you in life no longer apply. If you died a murderer, for example, that does not mean you are a murderer in the afterlife, because becoming a murderer was a byproduct of the environment that you had lived in. Even if you was born with some type of mental defect that caused murderous behavior, you are still just a product of the environment that you were born into. However, who you are is fully aware of any murderous behavior or any other nefarious activities that you had participated in during your lifetime. This does not mean that you are somehow absolved for something terrible you may have done in your life, because being a murderer in life can become a negative factor in your advancement as a spiritual being in the afterlife. Who you are has set goals to achieve when it sends part of itself to become you into the land of the living. None of these goals will have anything to do with killing someone or being killed. There would be no point in trying to experience anything in three-dimensional space as you. If that were the case, thou shalt not kill, from the Bible, is a phrase that is part of a repeating pattern that can be found in different religious texts throughout history in one form or another. There are those who say that the current form of the phrase was taken from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Egyptians probably got their version of that phrase from an earlier sun god. My point being, that the phrase in whatever form or language, may have been influenced originally by our residual memory. From the very beginning we knew that it was not right to kill each other, we just chose to ignore it, and religion has a lot to do with this failure. Religions publish, thou shalt not kill, and then tell you all the different ways you can ignore that commandment, eye for an eye, especially those that follow the Old Testament like the Jews and Muslims and the Orthodox Christians. In the Old Testament, there is even a right reason for killing your children. Death is only a physical experience that happens to you, and only affects who you are by what you have experienced in life. Who you are only happens after you die and has nothing to do with when you die. Only you have the power over life and death. Who you are has no fear of death. Only you do. We're all going to die. What if man evolves as a species, not just by the life one has lead with all the accomplishments achieved, but in the act of death and rebirth instead, your life's accomplishments help to enhance who you are. However, death and rebirth is what propels our species forward on the genetic level. When you die, you do not carry any genetic code with you into the afterlife, but you do carry a three-dimensional snapshot of it, which is spiritual DNA, that will become part of your new genetic makeup when you are reborn. If humanity's genetic evolution is pushed forward in death as well as life, every generation that dies helps to bring humankind closer to the next stage in human evolution. Therefore, it would seem that the process of life and death together would be responsible for the next stage in human evolution. Using this hypothesis, I also predict that one day science will be able to measure the evolution of generations genetically. Convergence. I think that our technologies may be just a crude reflection of how we live our lives in the afterlife, and I think this has been the case throughout human history. This is something that I think may be driven by our residual memory and a competitive gene yet to be discovered. For example, if on the other side we can travel almost anywhere we want instantly, that could explain the human desire to move faster and faster, from our early beginnings with horse and carriage, then trains and automobiles to the jet aircraft and space shuttles that are commonplace today. We are always trying to push the envelope of how fast we can move. The closer we get to the speed we are capable of traveling in the afterlife, the more alike we become. On the other side we can communicate and exchange thoughts, feelings, images, and sounds instantaneously. This could be matched up on this side with art, literature, music, movies, radio, TV, computers and all forms of telecommunication including the internet that we use today. Subconsciously our residual memory drives us because on that level we remember how it feels to live as we do on the other side. I think that one of the main catalysts for the next stage in human evolution has to do with how much alike we become, with how we communicate. For me this whole concept is fascinating. If technology keeps advancing the way it does, driven by the residual memories that we all have, we should see some type of convergence happen at some point in the future. I think it is possible that the future may be closer than we think. So what is the convergence? It is when the life we live here on this earthly plane begins to resemble how we live our lives in the afterlife. It is during this convergence that the human race will begin to go through a transformation, as the next step in human evolution slowly takes hold in the world. I think that these changes may begin to happen within the next couple of generations, or perhaps even sooner. But of course who is to say that maybe on some level, they may have already begun. So how do we handle this convergence? It has been stated that the way the human race advances is speeding up, and the rate that we learn new things is growing exponentially, and that the time between each milestone is shrinking, until things begin to change so rapidly, we may not be able to keep up. I personally think, while the future does seem to be problematic based on the concept of this accelerated learning curve, I think that our residual memory and the way our brain process new information and behavior will generally keep up just fine. Every new behavior we learn has a new chemical signature that goes along with it. That is why even after months of not smoking, an ex-smoker may still have cravings, even after the chemical components of that addiction are long gone. This is because the chemical signature for the behavior of smoking still exists, and can only become suppressed after the alternate behavior of not smoking becomes dominant. It is only then that the craving eventually fades away, but never forgotten. Even after years of being clean, the brain still has the capacity to whip up the chemical cocktail for that behavior, which could trigger a relapse. This example I've just gave can also be used to explain how we advance as a human race, because everything we do is influenced by learned behavior, and each learned behavior has its own chemical signature. Therefore, when we learn to do something new, we develop a new chemical signature to go along with it. Never before seen chemical signatures are created all the time. It is another one of those driving forces for humans. As the things we do in life become more complex, the more complex our chemical signatures will become. So I think we should be able to survive just fine through any accelerated learning curve, to the convergence and beyond. The next step in human evolution. What do you think the next step in human evolution is? This is one of my strongest thoughts, and the true message of this book. The next step in human evolution is, when we are reborn into this life, we will remember why we chose to be reborn into this life. From the moment of birth, you will already be aware on some level that you have a purpose for being alive. By the time a child reaches puberty, some subtle psychic abilities could begin developing. When the child becomes a young adult between the ages of 17 and 20, they will remember what their mission is for this life. and before that person reaches age 30, they will already begin to acquire true wisdom. I think we will see psychic abilities develop with this new race of humans, not as powerful as the abilities we have in the afterlife, but enough to add to the way we communicate with each other, in subtle ways. For example, you could not lie to someone from the new race. They would know right away that you were being less than honest. Subtleties like that. Maybe they would sense danger ahead of time and be more in tune with our environment. The list of changes that would be possible go on and on. You, and who you are, will be able to commune in both realms as one to a much greater degree than we are capable of today. Think about it. If the concept of life and death is the way I visualize it, even in some small part, and we are able to remember that we have a mission to fulfill, or some set goals we need to achieve in our lives, think how that could change the demographics of this planet. What would it mean to be one of the new humans? If we can remember our afterlives, we should also be capable of rationalizing why we remember. I think the fear of death, that is the predominating influence in how we rationalize our lives now, would vanish. Religious practices, as we know them today, would eventually become obsolete, and there would be no wars waged in the name of God. It would not mean the end of all wars, unfortunately, just a change in the rationale for going to war based on a completely new paradigm. Nevertheless, I do see a day when wars as we know them today will become obsolete as well. Now this next step in human evolution will not happen overnight. It will be a gradual change over many generations. We do not just turn into new humans. It will only begin to happen with the birth of a new generation. I do have a dire warning for this new race of humans as well, that I will discuss later on in this book, The Prophecies of Gorric Part 2 Vision Quest, The Quandary. Now, there is a lot more I could have added to Part 1, and I left many questions unanswered. However, to go any further, with any more of my thoughts from Part 1, I felt it is important to cover some of my personal experiences, as they pertain to my thought processes on some of the ideas I am trying to explain. This next section is going to be tough for me, because of the personal nature of the subject matter. Another difficulty for me is how much do I reveal? If I tell the whole story which began when I was a child, will the original premises I have put forth so far in Part 1, be overwhelmed by the intense scrutiny that revealing everything in Part 2 could bring? I am trying to keep this book from becoming a book that just the fringe interests would want to read. I want to reach as large an audience as possible. However, what I am about to explain in Part 2 will be considered obscure by many, in itself anyways. Therefore, I think I am going to compromise. I am going to stay on message, which will include some of my visions. I have been having visions off and on, throughout my life. However, I am also going to give a detailed account of how it all began, illustrating the catalyst I believe is part of the underlying cause of all my visions. I will only reveal the very beginning of this tale, which is part of a much larger story, which originally, I was not going to include in this book. My last quandary is, in what order do I present my visions? Do I reveal them in the order I acquired them, or do I present them within the timelines these visions represent? From the beginning I had a habit of looking down at my feet while walking as a child. It was a game I used to play when I was around 8 or 9 years old. One early evening, I am working my way down the road, heading home after leaving a friend's place. I had my head down, looking at my feet as I walked, while keeping the curb in sight out of the corner of my eye. The challenge to this game, however, was to try and guess how far I had walked, and how close I was getting to my house without cheating by looking up. When I finally stopped and lifted my head, I realized with a smile of triumph that I was standing right in front of my house. We lived in a one-story, back-split house with an open carport, where the front of the house faced east, and the back faced west. The house was also perched on a rise overlooking the rest of the neighborhood to the west. I remember feeling the low sun's warmth on the right side of my face as I stood there in the street as it began to set. I was drawn by its warmth. I remember closing my eyes as I turned and faced west into the sun's direction so I could bask in its comforting orange glow for the moment. Turning my head and looking east, I noticed the night's zenith approaching. I loved this time of the evening. I loved the way you could track the night's zenith moving across the sky. I remember wondering if I looked straight up, maybe I would be able to see the first star of the night. I used to like wishing on the first star as I saluted the sky to block the sunlight while stretching my head back to look straight up. I noticed the first bright star in the sky directly above me. I remember thinking how lucky I was, as I took a moment to search the rest of the sky above me for more stars, but found none. Now I'm sure I had only taken my eyes off the star above me for only a brief moment when I scanned the rest of the sky. Nevertheless, before I could finish assembling my thoughts that were beginning to materialize in my mind about what wish I was going to make, a bright object about the size of a quarter held at arm's length was there above me instead. Before I had time to express my amazement, a huge oval object over twice the size of a house materialized directly above me. It was floating silently just above the height of the TV aerials, which most of the homes had. Back then, it had gone from the size of a quarter to the size of the monster that hovered over me now. In the blink of an eye, without making a sound, I could not stop my legs from shaking. As I stood there paralyzed with fear, I was scared shitless and amazed at the same time, and I could not move as I studied the mirror-like surface of the object that had stopped to look me over. It was the first and the last time I ever remembered experiencing involuntary body movement. I also remember hearing in my peripheral, the lawnmower that someone was using across the street. Stop. It was then I realized I was not as alone as I felt. My eyes were glued to the object, and it felt as if time stood still. I could see the whole neighborhood reflected off the curvature of the craft's mirrored surface. The roof of my house was inverted in the object's reflective surface, with a reflected TV aerial, looking like it was close to touching the real thing. What made the whole experience even more surreal was the memory of seeing the sun setting, and the sun setting off the westward rim of the object. It was as if I was watching two sunsets, which is an image burned into my mind. To this day it was a huge egg-shaped mirror. Those were my last thoughts as I watched it slowly begin to float away from me, silently moving north up the street, while finally gaining altitude as it flew over my school before disappearing from sight. As soon as I was able to move, I went running, screaming my head off into my house, freaking my mother out. She thought at the time I had hurt myself. At first, she refused to believe the incident as I told her. We had a running joke going on in the family back then, where she would tell my brother and me she was from outer space. My mother thought at first I might have been influenced by her stories, until she heard the incident reported on the radio. I do not think she was ever able to bring herself to believe the personal nature of the experience of what had happened to me, as I had described it to her back then. What adult truly listens to a kid with the same level of belief they would have with another adult? Over 100 people saw this object, including my teacher Mrs. Davis from the school I attended, and it also made the news on the radio as well. It happened in Scarborough, Ontario, Canada, about a mile south of the CTV television station. I was 8 or 9 at the time, so this incident took place in 1963 or 1964, I cannot remember which. Trauma. Shortly after the encounter I described in the last chapter, I had something happen to me that traumatized me and scarred me for life. Even now, at my age, I can barely stop tears from welling up into my eyes when I dwell on the details of that experience. The terror may be long gone for me, but the ache is always there. Even though I am not willing to share that part of my story just yet, I believe the true catalyst of my visions was the experience of being traumatized, not the close encounter I had had. Visions. Age 8-15. Very shortly after having the harrowing experience that had traumatized me, I began to have visions. These visions were pure torture. I could always tell when I was going to have one by a strange feeling I would get just before they occurred, and after the first time, I always dreaded having them. Today I would describe those strange feelings as apprehension. The first time it happened, I was getting ready for bed. I remember once the vision had started, I thought I was going blind. The imagery of the vision was so strong it almost overwhelmed my normal eyesight. It would freak me right out and send me into a panic. I would run screaming for my parents, using the walls to guide me, hoping my parents would save me, but they never could. These visions I was having were always the same, like some message being repeatedly driven into my head, which I could never understand. They would always start out with the feeling I described. The images of these visions were always in black and white, on a black background until the very last part, which was in color. I'll try to describe what I still remember. It would always start with me moving forward through a corridor with evenly spaced bars of white light against a black background flashing by me on both sides. It was like flying through a tunnel at an incredible velocity. When I was older, I often thought that part of my vision was like moving through time. At the end of the corridor was a tall skinny stick man, with long skinny arms and legs, and within moments of seeing the tall stick man, a huge mass of a man would come up from behind, and wrap his huge arms around him. Slowly this big man's mass would start to envelop the stick man, and I would watch as the stick man was sucked into and absorbed by the big man's body until he was no more. I could never see faces at this part or any fine details. I do not know if this was because I was scared shitless at the time or the fact I always tried to fight my way out of these visions, or both. These early visions were always a struggle for me, because of the feeling of being totally out of control. After a moment, the scene would change, and I am looking at an outdoor cafe, with tables with large umbrellas, with flowers all around. This part of the vision is in full color against a black background with no people. In the next instance, everything is destroyed by an unseen force that violently slams everything sideways. This is where the vision would end, and I would come out of it. I always felt there was more, but I was never able to get past the terrace. These visions always felt like they lasted an eternity, and they were always accompanied by the feelings of dread and apprehension, and the intensity of those feelings would always increase to almost unbearable levels towards the end. When I was about 13 years old, I began to try to face my fears head-on. Instead of trying to fight my way out of my visions, I began to embrace them instead, hoping I might be able to figure them out somehow. It was always an unpleasant experience, right up to the day I had my last vision of this kind, at the age of 15. It is difficult to try to project the seriousness of the situation I found myself in as a child, and the utter helplessness of my plight. However, the story does not end there. Prolific visions. Age 19 plus. The first one, I was standing in my living room one morning with just my robe on, sipping a warm cup of coffee. The condominium I owned was on one of the floors closer to the top of the high-rise I lived in, which gave me a fantastic view of the lake this building stood on the shores of. The sky was clear, and the lake looked relatively calm, except for a vague dark line crossing the horizon in the distance. It looked like it could be a perfect day. The lake was a large one, and you could not see the far shore. It often made me think I was living by the sea or the ocean, instead of Lake Ontario. After taking a moment to get dressed, I once again entered the living room and gazed out across the lake. The thin line of darkness that extended right across the horizon, I had noticed earlier, looked a lot closer. I remember thinking a storm must be approaching, and my earlier observation of the perfect day had been premature. As I stood there and watched, I realized I could just make out movement like a churning in the clouds with brief flashes of light, which looked like lightning. I could also just make out the forward motion of the storm, and it looked like it was rapidly approaching. Suddenly I felt alarmed, as the hairs on the back of my neck stood out. The black mass I was staring at out of my window began to resolve itself in front of me. The flashes of lightning were getting brighter and faster, and the sounds of thunder seemed to be coming from every direction. The sky in front of me looked almost completely black and ominous. I could now see what looked like individual objects in the mass that was barreling towards me. Then the building shook and I felt the floor trembling beneath my feet. Quickly looking up out the window, I saw the blackness I had earlier thought to be a storm, had now taken on the appearance of a swarm of locusts. It was then I was struck with the realization that I was witnessing some kind of attack or invasion, and the flashes of light I saw and the thunder I heard were probably weapons fire. The building rocked with another explosion, almost knocking me off my feet, as I felt the floor beneath me rise up for a moment before dropping me back down. Within moments, I could hear the sounds of panicked voices filling the halls outside my door. I quickly bolted into action, grabbing a few things as I fled towards the door. Just before I stepped into the maelstrom in the hall, however, I briefly glanced at the calendar on the wall, which read today's date as March 21st. In the hall, people were trying to push and shove their way toward the stairways. I was able to briefly catch someone's attention who told me the elevators were out. As I joined the flow of the crowd, I could hear myself crowing for people to calm down. To no avail. I realized everyone was fighting for their lives, and if I expected to get out of this mess alive, I was going to have to look after my own best interest as well. After the brief struggle I had in the hallway, I entered the flow of people moving down in the stairwell. However, before I could begin my descent, I noticed an older woman struggling with her situation. Her black skin glistened with sweat, and the terror was clear on her face as she sat curled up in the far corner of the stairwell. I could see she was trying to keep away from the quickly shuffling feet moving by her, and I knew then I had to try to help her. After getting the old woman to stand and moved into the flow of people trying to escape, I tried to reassure this elderly woman that she was going to be all right and I would help her get down the stairs. Keeping the old woman in front of me, I used my body as a shield while hanging on tightly to the stairwell railing. I managed in this way to deflect the flow of people around me who were moving quickly downward from behind. slowing our descent to a manageable speed, but I could see this woman in front of me may never make it to the bottom floor, as she seemed to struggle with every step. Sure enough, at the next landing, the woman managed a weak smile and hugged me, then sat down in the far corner of the landing the way she had been sitting, curled up on the floor, one story above. I stood in front of her as the flow of people moved past my back. It seemed for a moment time stood still, as she informed me she could go no further and I needed to save myself. I hated leaving the old woman behind, but we both knew the truth of our situations, as sad as it was. Therefore, I pushed on down the stairway, moving once again with the flow of the people who all had the same determined looks on their faces that says one thing: escape. Briefly glancing over the railing, I could see what looked like outside light brightening up the stairwell about 5 floors below. There were also sounds of shouts of anger, mixed with what sounded like screaming coming from some faraway place. The noise from far below was a stark contrast to the quiet determination of the sounds of people's feet beating down the stairs around me, accompanied only by sounds of their exhausted or frightened breaths as the floors flew past. The clamor from below became louder and the stairwell kept getting brighter. I also kept getting whiffs of fresh air, and the further my descent took me the fresher the air was getting. Then the realization struck me. The faraway screaming suddenly all made sense. My mind then flashed to the scene outside of this building. Suddenly, I could see everything from the perspective of a spectator standing a short distance away. It was also surreal. This building seemed to be silhouetted against a background of a blackened sky filled with bright flashes, with fires burning everywhere around it. People were pouring out of the hole in the side of this building to their deaths like water flowing from a faucet. This image in my mind was like some contemporary vision of Dante's, or of Salvador Dali. When I snapped back to reality, I was hanging onto the handrail with all my might, hoping I could stop myself from moving any further towards what I instinctively knew was my death. The panicked people's frenzy to escape or oblivious to the danger below, kept pushing me downward as I tried to fight my way in the opposite direction. Gradually though, I was slowly losing the battle to hang on as I grew weaker, as each passing moment pushed me closer to the opening. Just when I thought I could not hang on any longer, my momentum down and forward stopped. The stairwell was suddenly quiet, and I was alone staring out of a hole that led to a world I did not recognize anymore. All of my visions I am going to discuss in this book take place at some point in the future. There are many things, which are not readily apparent, by just describing the cinematic aspects of these visions. All of these visions are interconnected in some way as well, and do not contradict each other. There are also the things that I know, as the individual within these visions, which have nothing to do with me, in the now. The overall implication of this vision implies that something terrible is going to happen at some point in the future. When I was young, I thought this vision might represent some type of alien invasion. However, with what I know now, I do not believe this to be the case. I think this is a man-made event that occurs before the next step in human evolution. This was the first of my prolific visions. I had this one at about the age of 20. This vision was in full color, with sounds and smells. I was able to read the calendar in my apartment even though I did not retain the year. I could carry on conversations with other people, which elicited responses. All the visions I have had since are as visceral as this one as well. What makes this vision of real interest though, is at the time, I was living downtown in the city of Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, when I had this vision. A few years later, I moved from downtown to High Park, which was in the west end of the city. At about the age of 25, I had acquired my driver's license and bought my first car. One day while I was driving along the Lancashire BLVD heading out of town, I saw the building from this vision. The sight of it floored me. I had to pull off the road for a minute to calm down. They were just putting the finishing touches on the building, as it was not open yet. However, this was the building from my vision in every detail, built right on the shores of Lake Ontario. I even went back one day out of curiosity and inquired on the prices of their condominiums. As it turns out, it was a very pricey place. Afterwards I avoided the place like the plague. Short but sweet, age 25-30, I am walking across what looks like a 6-lane causeway with a bridge. As I make my way across the bridge section, I begin to take in some of the details of my surroundings. I see a few rusted out shells of cars and trucks strewn around, some of them looking like they had suffered some violent demise, while others were barely recognizable. The bridge was a rusty brown color, showing its age, and any of the pedestrian guardrails that had once existed were long gone. It was obvious the bridge had not seen any type of maintenance in a long time. There were people milling about everywhere, some of them calmly walking back and forth across the causeway and bridge. Other people could be seen in groups and casual conversation. Everyone seemed to be dressed in a similar fashion, very rugged and durable, with lots of leather. As I walked by some of these groups, I could hear snippets of what was being said here and there, but it was never enough to make sense of any of their conversations. What was most interesting though was the fact I could perceive what some of these people were feeling. The people I felt the strongest connection to would turn towards me and acknowledge my presence as I walked by. I could feel the silent message of recognition pass between us, like we were trading a secret. The most important part of this vision had nothing to do with the cinematic aspect of it. What makes this vision stand out is I'm aware of some of the things this person has knowledge of. In this person's world, things have reverted to a type of tribalism. Towns and villages and what was left of some cities had all set up their own governments and territories, competing for the resources they needed. I never had the sense of any hostilities between any of the different factions that were going on in this person's world at the time. It seemed more like some type of cautious trading was more the thing of the day. I was also aware there were closed communities, which did not allow just anybody to enter them as well. Some of these are run by what was left of former government agencies that existed before the Earth's crisis, and some were heavily fortified and guarded. About a year or two later, a movie from Australia called Road Warrior came out that depicted a world that surprisingly resembled some of the aspects of this vision I had. What struck me about the movie was how some of the people dressed, and the tribalism that was depicted along with the struggle for resources. I found the similarities quite striking, and to me this is another benchmark in my research in regards to residual memory. That was it, a very short vision, but like all the other visions, it was in full color and I could hear conversations that were occurring around me. What is interesting was the time frame of this vision. It seems to take place after the next step in human evolution had taken hold in the world. Many people exhibited the same type of psychic ability as the person I represented in this vision had for years. This vision was interesting but meaningless to me. It was not until some of the realizations that I have had recently did this vision start to make more sense. The drooler's age 30 plus. I laid flat on my stomach behind a low rise on a hill overlooking an advanced and well-guarded settlement below. I could tell this was a scientific community, and not a military one, by just the way the place was laid out and organized. I was an advanced scout and spy from another well-organized community sent to spy on this one, to assess the possibility of a trade partnership in skills and resources. This was strictly a recon mission for me, although I am capable of much more. My mission was to disguise myself as a drooler, and wander into the settlement knowing I would be seized by their security and indoctrinated into the drooler infrastructure that every community had. Droolers are what's left of a human, after the being that had occupied its body abandons it. What is left is a human body with all its motor skills fully working, but without a mind that can rationalize or negotiate any complex thinking. The name drooler was derived from the fact that for some reason, some droolers drooled on themselves. However, that was not as common as the name implied, but the name stuck nevertheless. Droolers could be trained to do menial tasks including some labor. Most communities treated their rulers with respect, and took care of them with dignity and patience. After what the earth had been through, people had become on the most part a little more humble and retrospective to what life has dealt them. Rulers were never treated like slaves but were given tasks in the hopes the act would give them some dignity and a sense of belonging. Rulers are also harmless and generally gentle beings, without any form of aggression, and could not defend themselves any more than an inanimate object could. The new race was peculiarly sensitive to the needs of these beings, because not a single one of them is unaware of the fact. Only the new race was chosen as hosts for the invaders. Only one of the new race can fool one of its own kind, but it is tricky and takes a lot of training and testing. Even then, under close scrutiny one can still fail. Generally, members of the new race will recognize one another instantly. Droolers were once part of the new race. By shielding my mind a little, and emulating the behavior of a drooler, I usually have no problem fooling one of the new race for short periods of time. This task is made easier by the fact, droolers represent a repressed fear for most of the new race, because they know any one of the droolers they see around them could have been them. So generally, droolers do not garner too much scrutiny. I slipped back from the hill crest where I was hidden, and started to change out of my clothes. I was wearing metallic-colored clothes, which could take on the aspects of its surroundings, so I was practically invisible in the visible light spectrum. I was also wearing a weapon of some kind on my waist that I removed as well. After hiding the satchel I had brought to stash my things in, I was ready to go. I cautiously made my way towards the settlement in my new disguise. While I was mentally preparing myself for the challenge ahead, I knew once I was within sensing distance of the settlement that I would have to begin shielding my thoughts. The Drulars' thought processes are very spontaneous. Their minds are only capable of very little forward thinking. I had to try to copy the process if I was going to fool anyone. I knew I would only be able to keep up my charade for a few hours, so this has to be a quick in and out job. Sure enough, as I got within the perimeter of the settlement, security picked me up. It was not unusual for a Drular to come wandering into a settlement, so as long as my act held up, I was safe. They brought me to a large building and ushered me through a door, moving me down the hall by propelling me in the direction they wanted me to move, by placing a firm hand in the small of my back. After a short walk up the hall, I was escorted to a door on my right that opened up into what could only be described as a classroom setting. I was then prompted to sit at a desk where the table and chair were attached together. After listening to a brief exchange between the security officer and what looked like an instructor, in which the security officer informed the instructor that I had no identification, and he thought by the way I moved, that my motor skills were excellent and he had no trouble steering me in the direction he needed me to go, I knew what was coming next. Every Drular that's found is given some tests to assess their potential. These are mostly eye-hand coordination tests, and following simple commands. Drulars can be taught simple commands through repetition. I made sure I passed these tests at a moderate to high level, knowing I would probably have access to more areas of the settlement. After finishing the tests, I was led from the building I entered earlier. However, before I was able to clear the outside doors, I realized something had gone amiss, because waiting for me a few feet outside the door were two burly security officers, and by their stance and alertness, I knew my charade had just come to an end. After a brief struggle in which I thought I had a chance to get away, my vision ended, so I never knew if my persona in my vision escaped. In this vision, I was very aware of many of the things the person I was thinking, including knowledge of the environment he had lived in, which included some of the social structures of those environments as well. Of course, the most interesting aspect of this vision was the Drulars. What is a Drular? Originally, in this vision I did not have a label for the people with the psychic prowess. It wasn't until recently did I make a connection between my theory on the next step in human evolution and this vision. Therefore, I used the term new race for the first time when describing this vision, to illustrate that connection. So what is a Drular? A Drular is a member of the new race whose body had been possessed by an alien invader. This possession creates a disconnect between you and who you are. After the alien invader abandons its human host, the connection between you and who you are can never be re-established, creating the zombie-like state of the Drular. Intermission between the ages 35 and about 43, 44. I had very few visions. The ones I had were subtle or meaningless, and basically amounted to nothing. I thought that was it. I was done with having prolific visions. Then around the age of 44 or so, I started having these low-key, laid-back visions that had a bit of a personal touch to them. These new visions were also sporadic. I would have a few one year, and maybe nothing for the next year and so on. Anyhow, at the age of 49 I started having prolific visions again. I should also point out what makes my visions stand out when comparing my visions to a vivid dream, is the fact each of my visions are repeated over and over again. It is not uncommon for me to have basically the same vision a few days or evenings in a row. However, generally they usually repeat over a period of a few weeks to months. Therefore, without further ado, I will relate 3 more of my visions. There is no place like home. Age 44 plus. I am passing through a hall of an older house while focusing my attention on what is going on beyond the screen, or I am making my way towards. It seems to be a bright sunny summer day outside, which contrasts greatly with the friendly gloom of the interior. To my right I notice a stairway leading to the 2nd floor, and in front of me is an open living room with the screen door at the end. There are a few people milling about, all of them looking at me, and greeting me as I enter the room. 2 of the people seem to stand out more than the others. They seem very familiar, and they know who I am. One of these people is a young man, no more than 25 years old, about 6 feet tall, with a mop of unkempt but clean dark hair reaching down to his earlobes. He has a pleasant smile, and dark-colored eyes that telegraphs how genuine his greeting is to me. The other person was a nice-looking blonde-haired girl, with shoulder-length hair with a pretty face, but not quite as tall as the young man who just greeted me. However, she seems about the same age. She is happy to see me, and I could feel that we're attracted to each other as well. So what is so special about this vision? Well, I have had so many variations of this vision that I have lost count, all of them beginning in the same house. I know the house, and every time I have this kind of vision, I am often greeted by the same friends that I have never met before in my life. However, if I met one of them on the street I would know and recognize them. I seem to be romantically involved with the girl as well, although there had been nothing of a sexual nature to the relationship, and as most men know that would be very unusual if I was just dreaming. I have never remembered anyone's name in these visions, but in truth in real life, I am terrible when it comes to remembering names and phone numbers, birthdays etc. I am good at remembering the big things or things if they pertain to me in an important way, but stuff like the ones I just mentioned. Another interesting thing about this type of vision is, quite often I will notice the people around me seem to give me a bit of time to orient myself. It's as if they know I have just arrived, so they are giving me a little time to get my bearings. I always feel a heightened sense of strangeness when this happens. Here they come. Part 1 Age 50-51 I'm standing on a street corner on a bright lit summer day. The neighborhood that surrounds me has a European Spanish look to it. In a small town way, the environment is clean and friendly. I note as I start walking down a street that seems familiar to me. I had walked less than a block when I noticed people looking to the sky. Following their lead, I look up into the brilliant blue sky to see what is so interesting, and is halted in my tracks. Above me, strange flying craft were putting on a show. They were definitely not like anything I had ever seen before. They seemed to be low enough in the sky or large enough for me to make out in some detail, although the smaller ones were difficult to make out. The larger ones were remarkable. There was one large torpedo-shaped craft with what looked like portholes along its side, with some type of tail assembly on the end. It kept flying across the sky, then stopping with the rest of the group objects before disappearing in the blink of an eye, only to reappear a few moments later and fly off again at incredible speeds in a different direction. There were 3 or 4 other crafts of various sizes, that all had a similar look. I don't know if this variation in the different sizes was because I was seeing them at different altitudes, or that they were just different sizes. There was a high degree of strangeness. However, the objects were very blocky in shape and kept changing the geometry. One moment you would be looking at a long rectangular box, in the next moment it would fold into a 90-degree angle, or a 45-degree angle. They kept morphing over and over again. As I watched them, I realized I was only a few blocks from home, and if I hurried, I could go get my binoculars for a better look. So I rushed on, periodically looking up at the sky. I was almost home when my attention was once more drawn to the sky as Air Force jets came onto the scene. So I stopped and I watched as the jets cautiously circled the area, seemingly trying to keep a safe distance from the strange crafts, while keeping a close eye on them without confrontation. Taking off once again to go grab my binoculars, I raced around the corner to where I lived, and recognized the house that I had visited so many times in my visions. That is where this vision ended. The geometric aircraft that kept changing shape were very difficult to look at. They had a very blocky shape and could elongate and twist to some degree. In addition, the fact that the house from previous visions was part of this landscape was very interesting as well. Here they come. Part 2 Age 52 This is probably the last vision I'm going to publish in this book. It is almost identical to Part 1, with the same strange crafts in the air, and the military keeping a close eye on what is going on. Sometimes my visions are sequential, where the next vision would begin where the first one ended, more or less. That's what this next vision is. Just a day or two later, I am standing outside a brown brick varsity stadium, in the town I lived in. The large entrance to the stadium is directly across the street from me with its gates open. I could go waltzing right onto the field if I wanted to, but I do not think the spectators there would appreciate it. The blue sky was filled with a strange aircraft, and there are many people milling about like me studying the skies. There seemed to be an apprehensive feeling in the air, and everyone looked a little lost. As they nervously watched the skies, I was watching one of the strange geometric objects changing shape above me that seemed to be the lowest in the sky, when it suddenly stopped moving and just hung there. It was like looking at a fallen over L, standing upright, like an upside-down V. As I watched, I noticed all the other aircraft of this type had done the same thing and were in the same configuration. Suddenly, the objects began to fall from the sky like rain. The one I had been watching above me landed heavily in the stadium across the street with enough force to almost knock me off my feet. It was huge. People started running around everywhere in a panic. I noticed an opening in the bottom of the object that had landed in the stadium. There were beings that I could not make out clearly at this distance pouring out of it. They were wading into the crowds of people, grabbing them indiscriminately, as the people poured onto the fields, trying to escape through the main entrance of the stadium. Now this vision becomes hazy visually at this point, probably because of the crowds of panic people all around me. That's where the vision ends. Now this vision, like a few of the others I have described so far, has a lot more information to it than just the cinematic aspect. I knew what the strange beings were doing to the people they were grabbing. It was a realization I had, while having this vision. These beings were taking possession of these people's bodies, and they were not just grabbing people randomly either as I first thought. They were only taking those of the new race. This last vision was an important puzzle piece for me. It was this vision that caused a convergence between my thoughts and ideas, and my visions. Suddenly, visions that I have had in the past made sense to me now. I knew what the rulers were. I never did before, and who the new race are. Up until that day I had no clue. It all came together with this vision dart. Aliens. Now, I have something to say that you may find surprising after all you have read so far. I have a bit of a pet peeve when it comes to the term extraterrestrial when describing our visitors. I have been part of the whole UFO phenomenon in a personal way. I have kept a close study on the subject all my life, and in my life, no one has ever given me enough proof, including within my own experiences, that we're dealing with extraterrestrials. Now in saying that, I cannot come up with any better explanation either. I just think we should keep an open mind, until we have definitive proof, one way or another. More aliens. The reason a UFO has not landed on the White House lawn with aliens announcing themselves to the world, is that we're not ripe for the picking yet. They're not here as our friends. They want something they think we can give them. They keep abducting us, sampling us, and experimenting with us because they are looking for the signs of the next step in human evolution. They are looking for signs of the new race. Let me give you some of my impressions of these harvesters that I have so far. These beings only have their own interest at heart. We're dealing with a very advanced race that is crippled, spiritually. They do not have a greater self, like who you are, and the symbiotic relationship we have between you and who you are, and they want it very much. I suspect these beings do not have a natural body, but use a manufactured biological construct to interface in three-dimensional space. This biological construct does not have an independent emotional infrastructure, but relies totally on the entity occupying it instead, and there is very little of a symbiotic relationship, because the biological construct is not capable of independent thinking. They want what we have and are willing to wait for it, the way a farmer waits for his crops. These beings are not interested in the human race in general. They worry about our self-destructive tendencies because they do not want us killing ourselves off before harvest time, and this includes their concern with our environment. When the time comes for harvest, it will only be the new humans that will be at risk. They don't care about anyone else to the point that they will only fight with regular humans if they are attacked. Other than that, the old race will just be ignored. Unfortunately, for the new race, the old race will cooperate with the harvesters in certain parts of the world, by not coming to the defense of the new race. Otherwise, they will leave you alone if you leave them alone. Mentality takes hold in certain places out of expedience, of course. That's a hard lesson that isn't learned at first, as the human race fights tooth and nail with the invaders, because at first we do not understand that it's only the new race that's in danger, and not the regular population. So what is going on? When the harvesters take one of the new race, it possesses that person's body, like something out of an old horror movie. The purpose of this possession is to try to connect with who you are, with a plan of creating a link that would mimic the symbiotic relationship that all humans enjoy. So when the human body dies, the invader would be absorbed into who you are. They only want members of the new race because of their increased capability to interface with who you are. Now in the next chapter, what I have to say is going to be stranger than what you have read so far. I have something I have to get off my chest, which is not meant for human ears. Please keep in mind everything you have read so far are just my thoughts, no matter how convincing or not the message sounds. Message for the harvesters: if I had something to say to the beings waiting patiently for their harvest to come in, it would be this: it won't work. Your grand scheme you have planned is going to fail. Every time you take possession of one of the new race, the spiritual representation for that person will retract itself out of that person, and back into the spiritual main body of who you are, the same way it does during a regular death cycle, and it will do so no matter what technique you choose to try. No matter what you do, it will not work. It all boils down to one simple fact that you will never be able to overcome. You're not one of us. It is that simple. You're not human. Unfortunately, it will take one human generation before you realize that your experiment has failed. Nevertheless, I will offer you an olive branch. I believe there is a way you may be able to come closer to understanding and empathizing with the human race. That could eventually help bring you closer to your own goals. Join us, I guarantee. We will rub off on you, and just by being around us as much as possible will help you grow spiritually. There are some things that you can only learn from humans by being in their proximity and environment, and is not something that words or thoughts can convey, only experience. You may be superior to us in many ways, but we're giants compared to you spiritually, and have vast resources that will become available to us as we evolve as a race. You could be a part of that. In the end, after the harvester's failed experiment, they will just vanish out of our lives. Zombie-like husks will be left wandering the earth, which were once members of the new race, but are known by the name Druids. That is it for part 2. If I have any more visions before this book is finished, I will be sure to include them if they pertain to what I have written so far. End of part 2.